We will make a start. So welcome everybody to our April North Yorkshire Safeguarding Children Partnership Development in Safeguarding Masterclass. And I'm really proud and pleased to say that we've got Karen Hedgley and Elaine Wiley who are joining us. They are designated safeguarding children in care for the ICB. And we're here today to talk to you about the Ask Me, Have the Conversation campaign. So just a quick reminder on the housekeeping, I've already said this a few times, just please keep your microphones off. We'll record the session, so cameras off please. Feel free to add any questions in the chat, but I have put some time in for some Q&A at the end if anyone's got anything they want to raise. And then in terms of accessing the presentation, we will record this one and it'll be available on our website and also on our YouTube channel. So you can scan the QR or you can just go onto YouTube, pop in NYSCP and you'll find us, like and subscribe, and then you'll get a notification that of when it does pop up in the next few days. And then following this course, you'll get contacted by NYES, who are the training provider. They'll ask you to fill in some feedback, and then when you submit that, you'll get your course certificate to say that you've attended. So just looking at the agenda for the hour today, we're going to start off by looking at some learning from some of the thematic review and how that's built into where we've got to with the Ask Me campaign. Then we're going to look at some of the key messages from the Day or Night Sleep Right campaign, which is a campaign that the partnership has been running for several years now, but ties in so closely with Ask Me, and some of those key messages really do carry across. Then we've got the bit where we're going to kind of talk to you about the campaign and the Ask Me, Have the Conversation work and the resources. I will take you over to the website and you can see some of the web pages and the resources that we've put together for you. And then we are opening it up to you guys really. We want to spend some time just looking at what you guys feel the impact of the campaign will be, and opening it up to any questions. So please do kind of bear that in mind, and we'll ask you to pop some bits in the chat at the end. Okay, I will hand over now to Karen and Elaine, who will start us off with the thematic review.
Okay, thanks very much, Kat, and good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people joining this meeting. Karen and I are going to do a bit of a double act on the initial presentation, and then I'm going to hand over to Karen, who led very much on the development of the Day or Night Sleep Right campaign. So the thematic review. Many of you will know that very sadly, during COVID, we saw a significant rise across North Yorkshire in the number of cases of non-accidental injury to children. That was mirrored in other parts of the country. After COVID, the incidence of those cases dropped until the end of 2022, when we saw 3 cases of injuries to very small babies in a very short space of time. Now, each of those 3 cases was subject to our statutory requirements to undertake a rapid review, and the learning from that obviously was taken forward. But after the 3rd case, it was felt that we needed to look at some of the commonalities across the 3 cases to see whether there was any transferable learning on a wider footprint. So in January 23, the executive commissioned a thematic review of those cases. One of the key commonalities was that none of these families were open to any agency other than universal services within health. Because of that, it was felt that the review was best led by somebody within health who understood that quite complex health system that we have. And as neither Karen nor I were involved directly in any operational work around those cases, we've not been involved in giving advice or directly with the families, it was felt that we had sufficient independence to lead that review. It was really important, and Karen will talk about the panel shortly, it was important that although this was a health-led review, that we secured multi-agency engagement. So leads from the police, leads from social care, and leads from the business unit of our safeguarding partnership were integral to our panel working and to our learning. So if I can just move that forward. Here's a brief summary of the three cases, child N, child R and child S. So child N was 3 months at the point where they were admitted to hospital with seizures. The standard set of investigations show that this baby had a bleed around the brain and it had hemorrhages at the back of the eyes, which are very strongly associated with non-accidental injury. There were no previous safeguarding concerns known within this family. Some of the features of the case involved the parents reporting feeding problems, some challenges around mum's maternal mental ill health, and there were some concerns about how information had or had not been shared across health professionals. Child R was only 4 weeks old, and that baby presented with a swelling to the thigh. That's really unusual in such a small infant. Again, standard investigations were done, and this baby was found to have multiple fractures. Fractures of the femur, the long bone in the thigh, the ribs and the upper arm. Again, strongly associated with inflicted injury. The features of this case included father having a history of adverse childhood experiences. He had not had a positive experience himself. And both parents experienced poor mental health. Child S was 7 weeks old, and that baby came in with breathing difficulties. Again, investigations found that this baby had a bleed on the brain and rib fractures, which were consistent with inflicted injury. The features of this case, parental mental ill health, and one parent had presented to the GP and was awaiting a full assessment for potential neurodiversity, and that is significant when we start to understand the case in more detail. So 2 things I want to just highlight. One is, again, to reinforce that these families were not open to any other agency other than health. The second thing I just wanted to highlight was how differently these 3 babies presented. Seizures, a swelling on the thigh and breathing difficulties. And just to stress that non-accidental injury in small children often does not present as a very discernible injury. It presents in a slightly obscure fashion. And we really rely very heavily on our frontline health practitioners to think the unthinkable, to do the investigations, to understand and analyse the results of that, and to arrive at a conclusion that these presentations may be due to inflicted injury. So very different presentations.
Okay, next slide, please, Cash. Okay, so the methodology that we followed, I think it's probably really important to say that all 3 cases were considered as part of the rapid review processes, and therefore the individual aspects of learning for those 3 cases were already being taken forward by the partnership. But this was a thematic review, so we needed to understand what were the themes around the 3 cases that we need to consider together as a partnership in order to identify the learning. The methodology that we followed was loosely based on the SILP methodology, systems methodology, which is a recognised methodology for undertaking reviews of this kind. As Elaine has mentioned, we established a review panel and we had that external scrutiny from our colleagues within Children and Families, the business unit of the partnership, and from North Yorkshire Police. But the key body of representatives around the panel were from health providers, but also health commissioners across North Yorkshire. So we had a significant panel of people who were experts who were able to contribute well towards the ongoing review. We set ourselves some questions, some key lines of inquiry, which I'm going to talk through shortly. We had 2 panel meetings to explore those key lines of inquiry in detail. What was different to this review from other types of review is ordinarily we would involve the frontline practitioners. But because there had already been the rapid review, and because this was a thematic review of 3 cases, that wasn't possible in this situation. But we still wanted to gain the views of frontline practitioners around the key lines of inquiry. So we asked the panel members to go back into their own organisations and ask a key set of questions from frontline practitioners, so that we could gain those views, because those views provided a really rich seam of information to support the ongoing learning from the 3 cases. Then we developed the key learning points once we'd had the 2 panel meetings, and then we pulled together a final report which was presented to the NYSCP executive in January of this year. And the report was subsequently forwarded to the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. That's a national panel. We are required to do that. We're still waiting for feedback from the national panel, but we're hoping we'll receive that over the coming days. So that's the methodology that we followed. So moving on to look at the key lines of inquiry. So the first one that you'll see on the screen there was we wanted to explore how health professionals talk or get an understanding from parents of how they feel having a newborn infant will impact on their emotional and mental well-being. So it wasn't just about assessing a parent's mental well-being, emotional well-being, antenatally and postnatally. It was actually specifically around what the impact of having a new infant might have for them. The next area that we really wanted to explore, and as you can see, one of the common areas within the 3 cases were around perceived feeding difficulties for the infants. We wanted to understand how do we work together to support parents during the postnatal period when there are perceived feeding issues for the infant. So how do we recognise when additional support may be required? And what does that look like from the current commissioning arrangements? That was an important question for us to ask ourselves. We also wanted to explore how health professionals worked together to understand potential vulnerabilities within families. So how do we work together to understand those vulnerabilities, and how then do we subsequently support those families once we understand where the potential issues or concerns might be? The 4th key line of inquiry was very specifically around the ICON messages or the ICON conversations that were taking place with families. Now, I'm hoping most people on the call today will understand what ICON is, but just a very potted description. ICON is around working with families, sharing messages around normal infant crying and how best to respond to that infant crying in order to minimise the potential risks of abusive head trauma in infants. So that was one of the key questions that we wanted to ask ourselves too. So those were our 4 key lines of inquiry. Oh, and the 5th, of course, is around good practice. We always would want to identify good practice, and we will come to that later on in the presentation. And there absolutely were some areas of very, very good practice within these 3 cases, which we need to learn from, as well as the areas where we may have some perceived learning. Okay, I think we've touched on this already, but essentially just to say that we can in no way absolutely say that some of the areas of learning that we've identified absolutely conclusively led to the abusive instances for these children. But we do know from research that the factors that we have identified are common in cases of non-accidental injury of children. It hasn't been possible in these cases to seek the views of parents, which would have been very useful for the review. The reasons for that is that there are ongoing police investigations, and we run the risk of impacting on those investigations. So we've not been able to do that in this particular situation. So that's just obviously really important for you to understand why we've not been able to seek those views. Okay, so summary of key areas of learning for agencies across North Yorkshire. And I do stress that because although this review was largely focused on health professionals, because that was the universal services that were involved with all 3 cases, the learning can be translated across all partners across North Yorkshire. The first area of learning was about the development of professional skills. And we were really quite keen in the panel meetings that we had to look at what currently exists in terms of pre-registration, preceptorship and ongoing training of health professionals around the identification of vulnerabilities and response to vulnerabilities in families. So we were really quite keen to understand what that looks like. And we were also really quite keen to understand ongoing what would support practitioners in order to continue to develop their knowledge and skills around individualised care for families. So that was one of the key areas of learning that we identified. And you'll see the bottom point there refers to safeguarding supervision. We wanted to specifically mention that because we do know that safeguarding supervision is a cornerstone of good safeguarding practice. So again, developing professional skills is about education, it is about training, it is about preceptorship, but it's also about ongoing supervision for staff. So a critical area of learning was developing professional skills.
Okay, the second area of learning was around management of the unsettled infant, whatever that may mean. Now, we know, don't we, that babies are not genetically programmed to sleep, feed and gurgle contentedly in their cots. They will cry, they will be unsettled. And that crying is their means of communicating some form of distress, whether they're uncomfortable, whether they're hot, whether they're cold, whether they need a change of nappy, whether they need some cuddles. It is a way of a baby communicating. But for new parents, particularly inexperienced parents, that can be really quite distressing for them as they try and manage that for their baby. And they go through, as do we as professionals, a sort of checklist of what may be wrong. And the first thing, obviously, is this baby okay? Is it unwell? Is there some sort of physical, some organic cause, which means the baby just is unsettled and distressed? And it's really important that we address that and get it out the way. Has the baby got a temperature? Have they been sick? Is there a rash? All the normal things that both parents and health professionals will go through, and it's really important to address that. The second thing we need to think about is this baby crying because it is going through that period of enhanced crying that we know all babies go through? So it's established that from about 2 weeks onwards, babies will start to cry more. That crying reaches a peak at about 8 weeks and then reduces over the coming 4 to 5 weeks. That's normal. All babies will do that. The extent to which they do it is very dependent on each individual infant. But it's really important that parents understand that normal, what we call the normal crying curve. And that's what ICON, the programme that Karen described, tries to help parents understand and get their heads around. Babies will cry. They will cry sometimes if you have fed them, changed them, made sure they're nice and warm and cuddled them, and they will still cry. And as long as they are well, you've excluded all those organic causes we've talked about, then actually we're thinking about normal infant crying. And what we really need to be talking to parents about is how they manage that, how they cope with that themselves. You can't necessarily sort the problem out, but you can talk about your strategies for coping with it. We know that infant crying is one of the huge triggers for abusive head injury, what we used to refer to as shaken baby syndrome. So it's really important to talk to parents about how they're managing that. And as you may recall, when I described the cases earlier, I mentioned that in one of the families, one of the parents was awaiting an assessment for neurodiversity. Now, it's really important when we're talking to parents to have that understanding, because obviously for a parent with a potential issue such as that, crying may be an incredibly strong, vivid trigger, which provokes a sort of very negative reaction. So this parent was actually wearing earphones to help them manage the crying. And the question then, of course, is, well, how do you know how distressed the baby is? What are you going to do about it when the baby cries? We talked a lot about how the icon information is actually given to parents, and the panel considered at length the difference between information giving and asking the question. There's a difference, isn't there, between saying, have you heard about icon? Did you get that information before you left the hospital? And how's it feeling when your baby's crying? How does that feel in the middle of the night? How does your partner find that? What support have you got around you? So the panel felt that we needed to reinvigorate some of that work around icon. One of the other reasons that is often given for babies crying and being unsettled is that they've got a feeding problem. It's a very attractive explanation sometimes, and we find parents changing milk, changing feeding methods, and that can sometimes sort the problem out. It sometimes makes it worse, or certainly doesn't help at all. And we talked a lot about how parents who are experiencing what they believe to be feeding difficulties access support from professionals. We know that the health visiting service has changed over the last sort of 10 years or so. We wanted to understand what that change meant for parents as they tried to manage these problems. So some of the resources, if we go on to the next slide, Kat, that have been developed around that. Excuse me, one of our named GPs worked on a sort of flow chart to help professionals understand the potential causes for an unsettled baby. What were the red flags that needed urgent attention? What are the other things you need to work through with parents as you try and work through a solution with them? The other thing we really wanted to stress was that there already was a coping with crying plan available on the Icon website. We don't think that's being well used with parents to help them think about how they would manage crying, who's around to help them, and what they were going to do about it. Okay.
Okay, so our third area of learning was around support for parents with mental or emotional health difficulties. So as you've heard from Elaine at the beginning of the presentation, in the 3 cases, there was a theme running through where we had either one or both of the parents maybe had some ongoing mental health or a history of mental health or emotional health difficulties. But in none of the 3 cases did those mental health issues for the parent require secondary care input or intervention. And that's an important point to hold on to, because when a parent does require those secondary care interventions, there is a structured way in which those are accessed, usually via the GP referrals to adult mental health services, for example. But in these 3 cases, that wasn't the situation with any of the parents. So actually what we found in the panel meetings, we had a lot of discussion in the panel meetings, and the feedback that came back from our midwifery and health visiting colleagues, is that although the questions around the parental mental health had been asked, actually our colleagues were unclear about how to access resources that are out there in North Yorkshire for parents who don't reach that threshold, if you like, for referral to secondary mental health care. So that was a really important part of the learning for us. And coincidentally, around that time, Catherine Baker, who I think might actually be on the call today, was leading a piece of work in the perinatal mental health task and finish group to look at the resources that are available for new parents, both antenatally and postnatally. to map those out and bring those resources into one document. So that was always going to be really helpful for health professionals who were meeting with parents for the first time, identifying there was some underlying emotional health difficulties, but not being really sure about what services are out there to really support those families, both antenatally and postnatally. So if you move on to the next slide, please, Kat. What we have on this slide, you'll see on the left-hand side, this is a document that's been available for some time via the partnership, which helps professionals decide what level of support the parent might need when they have a mental health issue. And you can see the very straightforward flow chart there, taking you from the very high end of concern where there may be a risk of significant harm for the child, down to that lower levels of risk of harm for children. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the document that I've referred to, or the first page of the document that I've referred to, which essentially summarises the support that's out there for the emotional well-being of both parents. And that's the critical thing to say, is that we do have some excellent resources there out there for women, for the mothers, but actually what we needed to make sure that we included in this advice and guidance was the support out there for dads. So you will see there are QR codes coming up at the end of the session, which will lead you to all of these resources. But I have to say, this is a really outstanding piece of work, and I think it'll be a really practical piece of information for our practitioners to refer to when they're looking to support parents who have those concerns when they've just after they've had a baby. So really important. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please.
I just can't stress that enough. Particularly, I think we found practitioners knew a lot about what was there for mums, but very little about what was there for dads. So really important. In terms of good practice, there was some really strong practice. Very importantly for us from a partnership perspective, once non-accidental injury had been identified, there was a really robust multi-agency response to ensure the safety of both the babies concerned, but also any other siblings in that family. And it was really positive to see that. We also noted that the ICON message was delivered in all cases on multiple occasions in line with agreed protocols. They were established when we introduced ICON back in November 2019. What we weren't always able to identify was whether fathers were present when that information was shared, and secondly, how the information had been shared, as I mentioned earlier. We noted in one particular case, the contact with a family should have been a virtual contact, according to the mandated programme, but the health visitor had recognised that there was an additional need within this family and elected to undertake a face-to-face contact. And that was really good practice. It allows for a much more holistic approach and support for the family. We did also note that maternal mental health was repeatedly assessed, health visitors and midwives, antenatally and postnatally. And onward referral had been appropriately considered and advice sought in one case about whether that was mandated. However, again, as we've talked about, that was not extended to fathers or male carers. So we did have very little understanding about how fathers were experiencing those early weeks of new parenthood. Okay, so moving on, what were the next steps? Well, this was for all agencies, as Karen has mentioned, that although this was a review undertaken primarily across health professionals, the findings from this are not restricted to health professionals, nor to those health agencies that had a direct involvement with the 3 cases. So this is for everybody to think about what this review is saying around how we support our new and expectant parents. It is absolutely critical. We would invite everyone to contribute to the action plan, which will be formulated by the partnership, which will take this learning forward. and that will come out of the practice and learning. Got to check that because it's a new name, practice and learning subgroup of the partnership. We'd also encourage all agencies to disseminate the learning from the review across their own organisation, either by publicising the recording of this or by using the slide set to ensure that the learning is shared appropriately. And of course, directly arising from this review is the hashtag Ask Me campaign, which Kat will talk about at the end of the presentation. And we really want that promoted. What we're really asking professionals to do is to have the curious conversation, to explore with parents how it feels to take that new baby home and to manage when the baby is crying and unsettled and you're not too sure what to do next. Have that curious conversation. I think that's everything from the thematic review. So I'm just going to hand over to Karen now to take us through day or night sleep right before we pass to Kat to talk about how Ask Me.
Okay, so I think there may be a number of people on this session today who've already listened to presentations around day or night sleep right, but this is a fairly potted version because we've got limited amount of time. What I would suggest is that if you want the more full version of this session, you can access that via the NYSCP website, which goes into a little bit more detail. But it is really quite fundamental to the Ask Me campaign, which I'm sure all will become obvious shortly as I go through the session. So the Day or Night Sleep Right campaign really started back in 2020-21. I'll go through the background to it shortly, but essentially this is really trying to support professionals to understand and feel confident and competent to have those conversations with families about reducing the risks of sudden unexpected deaths in infancy. So you'll see on the screen there the definition that was pulled together by Professor Fleming back in 2000, and this is the definition that we still work to, and that talks about the unexpected death of an infant, and we're referring to infants there, we're talking about under the age of 1 year. We tend not to use the phrase cot death anymore. The reason for that, it appears to imply that these tragic deaths only occur when an infant is in a cot, when actually a cot can be the very safest place for an infant to sleep. And we tend not to refer to sudden infant death syndrome quite as much these days as well, because that appears to imply that there's an underlying organic cause or a genetic condition, if you like, for the child. So we tend to use the phrase SUDI, which I'll be referring to as we go through the presentation. Okay, so next slide, please, Kat. Can you pop all of that up for me? That's great. Okay, so again, just looking at the national picture, and this is a relatively old graph. We're waiting for the new graph to be published, but we understand it's not going to look too much different to this. As you can see, this is a graph that is reflecting the incidence of SUDIs across England and Wales over a period from the 1980s up until almost 2000. And as you can see, that we had a sudden and quite dramatic welcomed drop in the incidence of SUDIs back in the 1980s and 1990s. Those of you who are on the call who were longer in the tooth like myself will remember a big public health campaign around that time, which centred around 3 key aspects, which was around sleeping positions for infants. It was referred to very often as the Back to Sleep campaign. It was around reducing the exposure of infants to passive smoking, and it was also around ensuring an infant doesn't get too hot, so the temperature, the environment for infants. And as you can see, that was a really successful campaign. So that campaign was largely attributed to this very welcome drop in the incidence. However, What we are still seeing each year is, on average, around 300 infants are still dying as a result of SUDI across England and Wales. And that number hasn't significantly dropped since around the early 1990s. There has been ongoing research. We do know some of the factors that can contribute towards the risks of SUDI, which I'll refer to later in the presentation. So that's the national picture. And then moving on, looking at a more recent publication. This report was published by the Child Safeguarding Practice Review panel. We refer to this as the national panel, back in July of 2020. The national panel decided to undertake a thematic review of cases referred into the panel where there'd been a SUDI. So these, as you can see from the Venn diagram here, during this period of time, there were 568 incidents referred to the panel, 40 of which were SUDIs in families who were already known to services and where there were already concerns about the risk of significant harm. So there were already issues of concern from a safeguarding perspective. And that sat against 325 SUDIs in total. Very critically in this report, what the panel identified was that although health professionals are rigorously delivering the message around safe sleep, that many of the families who most need to hear those messages and act on those messages are unable to do so, either because they're not understanding the messages that are being delivered, or there may be several other reasons why they're not able to respond to those messages. Critically, what the panel said was that the risks or the vulnerabilities in the families where there were SUDIs, these 40 cases, overlapped with the risk factors associated with abuse or neglect. Moving on to the next slide, please, Pat. So what the panel advocated is that, yes, obviously we need to continue with those public health messages, which we have seen that success with, but we also need to start looking at reducing the risks of SUDI through a safeguarding lens. So where we have families where there are increased vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities commonly are issues such as substance misuse, domestic abuse, concerns around neglect, concerns around mental health difficulties in families, we need to be considering what that means in terms of the potential impact of choices around safe sleep. So we need to be looking at SUDI risk reduction through a safeguarding lens. Moving on, please, Kat. So we had the national panel report, which was giving us some very clear messages, and coincidentally and tragically, we also at that time saw an increase in incidence, or perceived increase in incidence, of SUDIs in our locality where there were modifiable factors. So again, going back to that, where there were factors where there had been, at the time of the infant's last sleep, there'd been some unsafe sleep practice, some unsafe decisions made by parents. And that was looked at very closely in 3 of those cases, as well as the CDOP review of those SUDIs. There were also 3 reviews that took place across North Yorkshire and City of York. And the conclusion of both the CDOP audit and the 3 reviews was that actually we're seeing exactly the same things. It's almost a mirror image of what the national panel were describing to us. So moving on to the next slide, please, Kat. So as 2 partnerships, because we did this with our colleagues down in City of York as well, we set up a task and finish group, and the first task was to look at what are we doing already, what we're doing on a population level. And what we identified was positive, is that we were as a universal offer from health in particular, delivering the safe sleep messages well to our families. And we were delivering messages based on research, largely based on the information published by the Lullaby Trust, which I'll come to later in the presentation. However, that task and finish group also involved colleagues from other agencies, particularly our colleagues from Children and Families Service and our colleagues from Early Help as well. And what they were telling us is that actually their colleagues didn't feel necessarily confident and competent to be having those conversations around safe sleep, because this has largely been seen as a role for health in public health messaging. So that led us to develop a paper that was presented to the executives, and then subsequently the executives agreed that we needed to develop what we referred to as a prevent and protect model, which subsequently led to the Day or Night Sleep Right campaign. So the aim behind that campaign, and it's an ongoing piece of work that we need to keep revisiting, was to support professionals, increase professionals' knowledge and skills around safe sleep, so that they can support the health professionals in delivering those universal messages and having those conversations, going back to that word again, those conversations with parents around safe sleep. So moving on, please, Kat. What we haven't got time for today, and again, I really urge you to perhaps listen to the more extended version of this session. We haven't got time to go through each of these key areas, but essentially in the guidance that we're going to show you shortly, there is more details around the parental risk factors, which can increase the risks of SUDI. The more information around individual children, so there are groups of children who may be more at risk of SUDI. There's some very specific information around environmental factors which increase the risk, particularly around the sleep environment for the child. And really importantly, there's some information in the guidance around situational risks where there may be a change in circumstances for the family, because that's a common factor that we see. There's a change in circumstances, and therefore the decisions around sleep space for the child may not be as robust as what we need them to be. So moving on, please, Kat. And next one. So this is the guidance that I'm referring to. So from today, your bit of homework is to access the guidance and to look around those key risk areas so that you feel confident in having those conversations with families around safe sleep. So please do access that guidance. It's just recently been updated by Kat. Thanks to Kat for that. But it gives you some practical information about how to open those conversations with parents, because they're not the easiest of conversations to have, but it gives you that some phrases, some terminology, some ways of discussing with families around safe sleep. So please do access that guidance. Next slide, please. Other key things that we want you to take away from today's session is that identifying and responding to risks needs to be a dynamic and responsive process. And by that, what we mean is that situations change in families. Their living circumstances may change. There may be a particular incident or something that leads the family to be living in a slightly different way. So we need to revisit those conversations, not just deliver those initial messages. So retouching with parents what they're doing around safe sleep. When we're talking about professional curiosity and respectful uncertainty, that's actually referring to we just need to be curious around safe sleep practice within families, because what we found in some of the reviews that we've had is although the initial conversations around safe sleep have taken place, actually the families were relaying to us what sleep circumstances the infants had, but actually in reality, in practice, on a day-to-day basis, that wasn't necessarily the case. for the infants. So it's actually having that professional curiosity. Avoiding a list of do's and don'ts. So what that really means is that giving a parents a list of this is what we would suggest you do, this is what we suggest you avoid, isn't ideal, because we need to be having those conversations with families, because what we do know is that when we give parents a list of do's and don'ts, they may choose the ones that they can actually initiate and get into place, but the don'ts might be a bit more difficult to achieve, so they may not necessarily take forward that advice. So having conversations rather than lists of do's and don'ts. And that goes alongside the next point about motivational interview techniques. So talking to parents, what would you do if? What would happen if? How can we help you with this? And as I've said, supporting parents with changes in family situations. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Okay, so these are the other things we would like you to take away from today. As we've talked about, the national panel and our local reviews advocated a prevent and protect approach. And what that also means, very importantly, is that SUDI risks must be part of all assessment processes when we're working with families with infants. So if the family are open to early help, they're open child in need, or indeed might be open in child protection, the assessment processes around those multi-agency interventions, working with those families, must also include SUDI. So what are the risks of SUDI with this family? And therefore they then need to be reflected in the multi-agency plans. And usefully, we are starting to see that in our multi-agency audits, we are starting to see that coming through, which is really helpful and very welcome. What we also want you to do is what I've already referred to, is to reflect on that resource that we've highlighted, increase your own knowledge around this particular area, so that when you are having those conversations with families, you're really confident that you're giving the most up-to-date information advice, and you're really confident in supporting parents to make the safest decisions. We also want you to think that actually, does this family need that additional support? If you are providing that safe sleep advice, and those safe sleep messages are not being taken on board, and there are some very specific risks that you're seeing, that needs to be reflected in your conversations that you might be having with your safeguarding professionals. It needs to be reflected in your supervision around cases, if in fact that's involved in your role, having safeguarding supervision. So have those conversations as well. Next slide, please, Kat. And this is just to highlight to you the information that parents are given. So you're aware what parents are getting from health professionals. So what we've got there is on the left-hand side, there's some information from a group called BASIS. That is, again, a nationally recognised group. But probably the most important one for you to access is the information that's developed by the Lullaby Trust, because the Lullaby Trust information is the information that is given to parents by health professionals antenatally and postnatally. So that's the standard information. So as well as familiarising yourself with the guidance for you as professionals, familiarising yourself with the advice that's given to parents directly by health professionals would be really useful. Okay. Next slide. And over to you, Kat.
Just before we do, can we just stress again the really strong links between what Karen's just been talking about in terms of SUDI prevention and ICON. You know, parents who are trying to deal with a crying baby in the middle of the night will often make unsafe sleep decisions for that baby. So these two campaigns are just so important in terms of how we support those parents and protect our very young infants. Sorry, Kat, I will shut up now and hand over.
Thank you so much, Karen and Elaine. It's always so informative to hear those key messages. And for me, it just highlights how important the Ask Me, Have the Conversation campaign is in terms of kind of wrapping up some of that learning and really building on the messages of day and night sleep right. So I'm just going to have a few minutes with you kind of talking through the fundamentals of the campaign and how you can access the resource materials. And then we'll have a few minutes at the end just for some feedback and some questions, if that's okay. So this is kind of our logo and a lot of our branding on this slide, and please do feel free to use and share this. The QR is there for your convenience, that can kind of take you there on your phones when you're out and about, home visits. It's a really quick and easy way to access the page. But if we talk about the actual campaign, you know, I'm really drawn to what Elaine and Karen said earlier on, and it's really kind of the premise of our campaign is it's not about information giving, it's about asking the question and fundamentally having a conversation. So this campaign and the resources around it are a professional facing campaign, so it's resources primarily for professionals, but again it's that conversation, it's that open and honest and safe opportunity for parents to talk about their challenges and what life is like as a new parent. And it's about really kind of encouraging that professional curiosity, you know, fundamental to fully understanding the lives and experiences and the perspectives of the families that we support. And I'll cover that a little bit more later on. As I've already said, we've got the web page, which is kind of, as from a partnership perspective, we want you to see that as a centralised hub. So based on a lot of the resources and the information that Karen and Elaine have shared, we've centralised that around safe sleeping, safe feeding, icon, and again with specific information for dads. So if as a professional you're kind of not quite sure where to start, or you couldn't quite remember the icon acronym, so you're not quite sure what to Google, you know from a partnership perspective it's all on one page, and we will make sure that that page is up to date for you as well. So I won't take you to the web page, but the link is there and the QR is there. If you just go to our NYSCP homepage, you will see that there is a tab right on that front homepage that will take you to Ask Me. Similarly, on our drop downs, we have a professionals tab at the top. It's the first drop down on that professionals tab, so you can access it. The Ask Me page has lots of information. As I've already said, we've included things like Karen talked about in terms of the mental health guide and the day or night sleep right campaign materials and practice guidance. Just to make you aware, we are waiting for the updated design to come through on the day or night sleep right updated guidance. The information is fundamentally the same, it's just some of the links we may need to update. So if you do need to use it, that information is still there. And here we just wanted to share with you some of our campaign materials. Those of you who follow us on Facebook and X and Twitter, Instagram, hopefully will have seen these through the week. We're dropping a couple of these every day this week, but these are social media assets that we will continue to share. This isn't a message that we share for 1 week and then move on from. It's something that was really important that we keep sharing. And the fundamentals of our social media campaign is all around kind of the challenges and the real face, shall we say, of what parenting can sometimes look like. You know, we often will see on social media the very social media formatted images of parenting and how wonderful and joyous and happy it is, and we know that there's elements that are wonderful and joyous and happy, but we also know there are times when you are just so tired and so unsure of what's going on, and we really wanted to highlight some of those challenges. And you'll notice as well, we've been trying to be as inclusive as possible, include dads in these images as well. It's not just mums who are struggling. So here's just a highlight of some of them, and they're all kind of sharing some of those conversation starters or ask me's to just really kind of get you off on that right foot of being curious and opening up those conversations. I like the one at the bottom right where you can guarantee that woman drinking that coffee that it's a cold coffee, but again you can see the challenges there. I just want to touch on professional curiosity. I've already mentioned this is something that can be applied to all of our relationships, you know, whether that be with young people, parents, new parents, other professionals. And it's not about just like I've said, delivering that message. It's about being curious, asking those curious questions. So when we're talking about those messages around safe sleep, if we're having a conversation with a parent and they might just drop into the conversation that they're planning on going away or visiting family or friends, or there's a, you know, be curious about that. Start to have some curious conversations about what the changes in the sleep routine will look like and how they're managing that sleep safely. So don't just take it as a given that, oh, they're going away, or that's lovely. It's start to just ask a few more questions. Professional curiosity obviously is something that kind of runs through all of our professional practice, and we are in the process of updating some practice guidance around that. So please do keep a lookout. Early May, we're hoping to get it out. It will be linked onto this QR. This QR at the minute takes you to our current guidance, but there will be some some more updates on that as well. And then, as I've said, the campaign highlights a few of those Ask Me's through our social media campaign and on the website, but we would like professionals to really consider those conversations and just kind of think of a few more in terms of what life is like for supporting that family. So go a little bit wider. Think about parents of multiple children. How has that addition of a new baby changed things? You know, thinking about what Karen's talked about the mental health of parents. Think about those parents who maybe become a new parent who have had older children, who've had a new, you know, first time they've had a new baby in a while. What are the changes? Do they understand the changes in the guidance, the messages that have been shared? You know, don't just take it as a given, or they've had children before, they know all this stuff. A really key one for me is to think about the dynamics of a couple and the couples of parents and those changes in relationships and what that can bring what a new baby can bring to that. And I've already talked about being really curious about those changes in routine. If you've got a parent who is smoking, or someone in the house that's smoking in the house, how are they managing that safely, or do they want any support in stopping smoking? And just to really want to be kind of curious and mindful of at the end is, if you've got a family that may have suffered previously a bereavement of a child, having a new baby may really impact on that mental health and bring that kind of that initial bereavement into a new light. So it's another thing to be curious about and ask the questions of, do they need that bereavement support, even if they may have turned it down before? So this list could be endless, and what we've done as part of the Ask Me campaign is just give you some starting off points, but the ask is for you guys as professionals to continually be professionally curious and provide families with that opportunity to speak and be open, to share their concerns, to know that they're going to be listened to and heard. So for the last few minutes, I'd like to just hand over to you, and this is where we go into the chat. I think there's been a few things that have popped up in the chat, and but I'd like you to consider the following questions really. Number one is, how will you use the Ask Me campaign in your role? Number two, do you think it will have an impact in the families that you're working with? What impact will that look like? And then finally, we would like to hold a focus group in about 12 weeks, 3 months or so, where we get partners back together to talk about the impact of the Ask Me campaign, how partners have used it, how colleagues have used it. So we are asking today for anyone to kind of champion as part of that role. Come back together. It will be an hour of your time maximum, where you can perhaps sort of speak to your teams over the next few weeks, promote it, start to gather whether or not it's been used and how important it's been. So yeah, if you would like to be part of that, please do let me know. Just pop something in the chat and then I can contact you afterwards. But we've got Karen and Elaine here for the next few minutes, and we're happy to take any questions about the campaign, but please do share your feedback or any thoughts in the chat as well. And that's it. Thank you.
Can I just come in on one of the points, which was a very good point, but hopefully I've cleared it up by responding. There was a comment in around replacing the Lullaby Trust guidance. That's absolutely not the case. The Lullaby Trust guidance is the guidance for professionals to share with families directly. The multi-agency guidance on the website is for professionals, so supporting professionals, particularly professionals who aren't necessarily the ones giving those primary messages and universal services. particularly our colleagues from Children and Families Service, Substance Misuse Services, Domestic Abuse Services, etc. It's to support those professionals to back up the messages, if you like, that are being given on a universal level and to have the conversations. So hopefully that helps.
The question about the resources available in additional languages, translation function on the website, Hannah, Kat?
There are some resources. I can't quite remember. If you bear with me, I can look at the end of the meeting, but I think there's some on the Lullaby Trust that are available for other languages. But it's something that we've looked at before, isn't it, Hannah, around translatable resources on the website. So we'll keep looking into that.
Yeah, I think it is as a kind of more general conversation really about how we make sure that we're reaching everybody that we need to in terms of the you know, the most helpful languages that we can put practice guidance, etc. in.
And certainly on the ICON website, if you click on that and go into one of the functions on the top tag, you'll see there is a translation function. So if you're working with a family, you can select which language they speak, you can highlight the piece of text, and the website will speak to you, translating that text into whichever language you've selected. And there is a vast variety of languages to select from, so that is really useful.
There's also something in the chat there from one of our colleagues from HDFT saying about the 0 to 19 Growing Healthy app. We'll also have the ability to translate all information into other languages as needed.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll stick around for another couple of minutes if anyone does have any questions. Please continue to pop things in the chat. It's really helpful for us to know how you're going to use this campaign and how you're going to share the messages, and it's great. I can see lots of people who are really interested in coming back together in sort of 12 weeks, 3 months, to look at a little bit of a focus group to see about the impact it's had and how useful it's been. Can I just take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Karen and Elaine for sharing all the wonderful learning that they've managed to share with us today. This will be their last masterclass, and it's been a good one to finish with, I think, with such an incredibly important campaign. So thank you so much, Karen and Elaine. Yeah, we'll stick around for a minute or two if you need us for anything else.
Kat, just to jump in, it looks like we've got somebody with their hand up, or a couple of hands.
Oh yeah, sorry. Katie, you've got your hand up. Do you want to just come off mute? You can.
It's not Katie Clayton, actually, it's a colleague, Sue Flatton.
Right, okay.
We think the presentation's been very good and the information's been very informative, but we feel as though we already actually do a lot of this. And what we find on the ground that we often struggle with is how much we've got to pack into one new birth visit.
Yeah.
And I just think that for us, that's the issue more than although this has been informative, it's kind of what we do, but we just we've got a lot to fit in one visit, and that's where we think the issue lays.
Yeah, and to be honest, that was a conversation that was rehearsed a lot at the panel about all this is important, so are all the other things that we ask as health visitors, and Karen and I are both health visitors by background, so we absolutely know where you're coming from. One of the other things that was discussed, though, is sometimes how practitioners are able to undertake that very complex visit with all that information is very dependent on their level of skill, their relationship with the family, their training, their understanding of SUDI work and ICON work and all the rest. And so we had a lot of conversations about how best to help practitioners to feel confident and competent to have that discussion. But we don't underestimate the ask of our health visiting colleagues. We know it's massive at the moment. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah, we agree.
I think the other thing about the campaign is that we're trying to go wider reaching than just health colleagues, with the understanding that all professionals, regardless of their interaction with a family or new parent, are aware of some of these kind of conversations to have and can raise those concerns. So it's not just for health professionals, it's for anyone that would come into contact with a family, really.
I've just noted the question from Rachel there about a contact email. Karen and I both retiring next week, so I'm afraid it won't be us. But I would suggest the best way is to email the partnership directly, because it's the partnership that's leading this campaign. Is that okay, Kat and
That's
Hannah?
fine, yeah. Yeah,
I can see Hannah busily typing. She's probably putting it in the
Emma's
chat.
on it. Who was the quickest typer?
Hey. Thank you.
Another hand up from Fiona. If you want to come off mute, please.
Hi, I've just put a note in the comments and in the chat, and I've just realised that I've put increased safe sleep habits. I'm meaning increased risks.
Yeah,
I've seen a lot of babies on their tummies recently, which I haven't seen for many years. So yeah, obviously messages aren't getting there one way or the other.
Yeah, absolutely, Fiona. And, you know, with the invention of all of these new, well, I would say newfangled methods of settling babies, such as baby nests, etc., we know that they are not advised by the Lullaby Trust. They're thought to be a concern. So there's always going to be something new, some social media influence, etc., which may impact on decision making, which is another reason why we have to keep revisiting these conversations with families as a partnership, not just as one particular professional group.
I think the other thing that gave us rise to a lot of concern was a particular device aided to support prop feeding. You know, the risks of that are manifold, and it's trying to stay one step ahead of what's new on the market, isn't it? And to be talking to parents about safety. Okay. Lots of people offering to join the focus group, which is great. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing the results of that on the website.
Yes, we'll put it on. We'll make sure you are fully aware. Yeah, final thanks again to Karen and Elaine for being the driving force in this campaign. We will draw the masterclass to a close now, but again, please do email the partnership. Emma's put the contacts in the chat if you've got any further questions. But please use the campaign, share it as far and wide as you can amongst your professional networks, and hopefully it has a really positive impact. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.